So to begin with, I think uh, we can say that the conversations around AI in education or AI in general are still very much going on. And you have people arguing for either full assimilation or a total ban of AI use in the classroom. And I personally stand on the belief that the correct response is somewhere in the middle, as they usually are. But whether you're hesitant or you're enthusiastic about using AI, the fact is, whether we like it or not, AI is here and it's probably not going away. So, our job as teachers has always been to prepare our students for the future. And that future currently looks like one where they will need to use AI on a daily basis. So we need to teach them how to use AI meaningfully and ethically in a way that doesn't undermine those particular skills that make us human. So what AI is doing now is it's forcing us to reconsider what we do in the classroom and the fundamental beliefs and assumptions on which those practices are built. You know, we need to start asking questions like, are they still effective? Are they still relevant? Are they even still valid? So, in the first few weeks following ChatGPT's introduction to the public in 2022, I think, there was widespread panic among educators who were growing concerned about students using the platform to cheat, quote unquote, on their homework or on their required tasks, particularly in writing and problem solving assignments. Fast forward to today, and I'm sure you've seen many of the headlines. And those headlines, they appear to validate those early concerns. You have all of these articles on various platforms screaming about how AI has destroyed assessments and everyone is cheating on ChatGPT. I'm not going to invalidate those concerns. These are legitimate issues that need to be addressed moving forward. But what I also want to do is take a step back to look at the bigger picture about why AI is creating these issues around assessments. I think there are certainly questions and criticisms about the validity and effectivity of traditional assessments long, long before um, ChatGPT came along. Cheating, for instance, has always been a problem. It's just that now AI is making it easier to cheat, quote unquote, at least the way cheating has been traditionally defined in the academy. Another question is whether these assessments in their traditional forms can actually see learning. There certainly have been studies that suggest they do not. So this is an opportunity to finally, I think, take seriously old concerns that have largely been brushed aside, even ostracized in the past because assessments gave enough of an illusion of effectivity to justify maintaining the status quo. But AI is forcing our hand. We no longer have a choice. So the most common response to the effects of AI on assessments has been attempting to design AI-proof assessments and then relying on AI detectors to catch those who outsource too much of their thinking and their writing to the machine. Some have interpreted AI proof to mean adding complexity to the tests and questions to force students to think more, to reason critically, and there's definitely an argument for that, even before AI, but I think only up to a certain point. The problem is it's extremely difficult to design AI proof assessments, especially at the basic level of learning. And as we heard in an example earlier, AI detectors are unreliable at best. For one, it is next to impossible to find tasks that computers cannot do faster. And if you could, they would likely be too hard for students to do. Also, as much as we talk about the need for developing critical and creative thinking skills, those skills need to be built on a mastery of the facts and fundamental concepts, which serve as the building blocks of reasoning. We cannot bypass learning the basics on the way to complexity. Doesn't work. So the issue really is that there's no point in making assessments AI proof. It's like aiming at a fast moving target. We will never be able to keep up with the advancements in the technology. As soon as we figure out how to make it quote AI proof, AI makes an advancement that renders that meaningless. So the challenge is about finding ways to design assessments that AI will not render irrelevant. So since the introduction of AI, educators have bemoaned the students turning to AI to cheat on their work. But I think it is necessary to confront the question of why that option is so compelling to students in the first place. It's so easy to just say, well, the kids are lazy, what can we do? It's probably overly simplistic, and we should dig deeper. We need to ask ourselves whether the problem really is that students are turning to AI to do their tasks, or whether this behavior is merely a symptom of a much deeper systemic problem. So the reason that the existence of AI seems to be at odds with traditional assessment has a lot to do with the behaviors and attitudes that are incentivized by the implicit messaging embedded in the system of rewards and penalties that are based on the outcomes of assessment. You see, many of our assessments are built on a paradigm of rewarding surface polish on finished work, meaning the emphasis on correct answers, the lack of opportunities to refine or revise submissions. That submission is the final finished product. That's where you get your grades. And probably most significantly, the penalties on poor work, which are imposed through a deduction in points, which can lead to lower grades, which can lead to missing out on awards and honors, for example, or probably worse, losing access to certain opportunities in the future. The problem with that design is that the assessments and the grades determined by their outcomes become the ends of schooling rather than a mere step in the entire learning process. The tests come to be treated as something that comes at the end of teaching rather than a part of teaching. And then success in school comes to be defined by the outcome of those assessments rather than learning. So when the test becomes the goal, it dictates everything from how we teach, what we teach, how much time we spend on a lesson, and how we respond to students who struggle or those who don't. And usually to the detriment of both our teaching and learning. There is a classic book in education from 1986 by Linda McNeil entitled Contradictions of Control. She did a study of schools across Texas to reveal how an emphasis on test results as, quote, evidence on learning actually had the opposite effect of degrading both the teaching and the learning of students. Which is why she wrote, the more measurable the outcome, the more likely it is to be meaningless. How can it degrade our teaching? When testing became a central part of the education system, this was part of the movement to emphasizing accountability, which required a tangible means of measuring how effective teachers and schools were at teaching their students. So naturally, this put a lot of pressure on teachers to ensure good test results, which affected the way they teach. They shortened the time they stayed on a lesson in order to finish the coverage of a test. They talk to the test. This is a phrase we hear a lot, meaning teachers design their instruction around questions that are expected to appear on a test. They also made tests and tasks less demanding to ensure that students can easily get good grades. Of course, this also had unintended consequences to the students because it sent the message to the students that the points you get on those tests and those assessments are what matter most. And the nature of the assessments told them that the way to get those points is simply meet your teacher's expectations by ensuring your work is as polished and accurate as possible. So students know. I knew when I was a student, my peers knew, my students know now. They don't actually need to learn anything in order to pass or even to get a high grade because most tests allow you to simply remember and replicate and you'll succeed. What we said earlier, it was a unanimous agreement. I remember struggling, making mistakes, making a mess. These things are supposed to be a natural part of learning. We all agreed to that. Yet somehow the system is designed to penalize them. So, I'm sure that most of us here have at some point needed to encourage a struggling student, perhaps even your own children, by saying something like, it's okay. This is a natural part of the learning process. You just have to keep learning. You have to learn from your mistakes. Don't quit. Work harder. We want to say that, the struggle is the point. That's when you learn. There's just one problem. You don't earn points for struggling. In fact, the more you struggle, the more points you lose. And the risks attached to losing points make the struggle not worth it. So, in that context, you can understand why students turn to AI, because it allows them to bypass the struggle by exerting less effort in less time while still getting the optimal results, which is getting the good grades, scoring high. Why are students content to just pull all-nighters before the deadline of submission for some requirement? Why are students content to cram for a test? Because it works. The system reinforces the behavior by rewarding it. If the points are all that matter, there is no value in struggling or investing too much time. I know that for some of us, it's also dependent because of some of the responses earlier. That might be a little difficult to swallow, but I invite you to take a moment to consider this very important shift in perspective. When students use AI to complete their work quickly and perfectly, they are merely behaving the way the entire system has taught them and rewarded them for years. Don't struggle. Do things the right way, exactly as you are told to do. Do it fast. Stay on schedule. Students turn to machines because we have been asking them to learn like machines. We left very little room for humanity in our education system. So, to redesign assessments meaningfully, we need to change the culture around assessment and the value that we attach to it, to put the focus back on the learning rather than the scores, to make assessment less the end of education, but a means towards learning. That's of course much easier said than done, and I will have more to say about that later. We need a system of assessment that doesn't reward taking shortcuts, but instead gives value to the struggle. And when I say make struggle valuable, I don't mean give it points, but to give it a meaningful purpose. Perhaps we can do this by treating learning less as data and more as, I don't know, more as story. It's not something we get to, it's something we go through. So assessments, therefore, should be more than just a means to find out how far a person has gone or how much further they have to go. They must be a means to help learners finish the journey. So, in this paradigm, the goal of doing an assessment is not to pass or to score high. The goal is to make progress. The points that you earn are not supposed to be the point. So, when we put too much weight on surface polish. We can lose the insight of all the nuances of the journey it took to get there. We could end up disregarding challenges the student needed to overcome, including anxiety or physical problems, possibly illnesses. Okay. Could have distractions in their personal lives, just insufficient background knowledge, linguistic barriers. There's a lot of factors. But besides that, we also don't see the ways that students thought about the task, the ways they broke down a problem, the possible misconceptions that led them astray, the ways that they interpreted a question in the light of diverse experiences and interests, how they may have fixed mistakes that they identified in the process of doing a task. When we focus on just the final finished product, we lose these most valuable insights that we can find in these hidden nuances. So when we talk about learning, we are talking about progress over some time interval. That progress shows up through changes, could be big or small. Those changes will reveal themselves in a person's behavior, beliefs, attitudes, patterns of thinking, etc. So to properly assess if a student is learning, they must have opportunities to demonstrate that progress, and not on multiple different tasks, but to show how what they're learning is refining their work on the same task. So what we want is to change the mindset around assessments. We need to change its purpose from merely from evaluation to instead guiding decisions about how to help individual students continue learning. It's not about the kind of tests we give. It's about what we do after an assessment. So in this case, what we want is for the test to no longer act as just a checkpoint, after which we just all move on and then go to another lesson and the kids feel like, oh, I can forget about this now. The message needs to change into learning doesn't end with a test. So I hope you can read this. For those of you who weren't here in the first talk, and maybe we can give you the link to that with that recording later. We talked about the need to make learning human again by lessening the demand on skills that machines can do more efficiently, and instead emphasizing more those experiences that are fundamentally human. We said emphasize the value of struggle. Focus on the process of learning over the product of it. Emphasize forming human relationships and allow space for individual agency. So allow me here to talk about how we can implement those changes around assessments. In the traditional testing paradigm, when we say learning, the construct is addition. We take in more and more information and we get evaluated based on how much of that information sticks. In a new paradigm, we could move from addition to revision, where mistakes and misconceptions are understood to be sources of insight towards making progress, and where there is an opportunity for students to correct them and make the necessary changes to their own understanding and to the execution of the task itself. We can also talk about progress. In the old paradigm, progress is just how high you score, but progress is subjective. It's impossible to completely plan out in advance how people make the journey from not knowing to competency to proficiency to master. Yes, standards are important in so far as we mean that when we say standards, we mean what counts as mastery. What we do not need is standardization. People cannot be standardized. We cannot plan out how and how long students learn, and it is necessary to consider the diverse backgrounds of our students in evaluating their learning. We saw that earlier. We had a lot of people agreeing to the idea that it's not fair to judge all students according to the same standards and expectations. So what we want to see is for assessment to be made meaningful by letting it serve as a map for guiding how to proceed and what to address for further development and progress, rather than the assessment marking the end of the journey with the scores, the prize to pursue. To, I don't know, use a different metaphor, assessments are not supposed to be a terminal diagnosis. It's just a routine checkup. The assessment has to point to something happening beyond itself. So we can now focus on 4 key components of process-oriented assessment. So those 4 components are documentation, feedback, iteration, and presentation. Now, of course, the specific tasks will vary in different subjects. In any subject, there is some form of written output or problem-solving output. So these 4 components can be implemented in any subject with a few variations to fit the specific demands of the subject. So let's go through each of those steps. First is documentation. Documentation is the process of emphasizing the process of it's the process of emphasizing the way students think and reason, their decision making, and changes in their understanding. So this documentation is for the students to track their own thinking. It's an exercise in metacognition. Metacognition, meaning to think about your own thinking. So in its simplest form, you could have your students keep daily or weekly logs to reflect on specific moments of insight that they gain as they acquire and assimilate new information, as they learn from their mistakes, as they deal with struggling with confusion and misunderstanding. So it is in these typically hidden internal processes of dealing with new ideas and concepts that learning really reveals itself. not in the polish of the final output. So of course, those documentations, because the Gen Zs and Gen Alphas are multi-talented in terms of, you can have them recorded in any medium, including of course, uh, traditional written text. It could be online blogs. It could be audio and video recordings. Perhaps they make their own podcast. You can also do it in collaboration with their peers, allowing them to benefit from the insights and perspectives that other students have gained that they perhaps did not experience themselves. But remember, the point here is it's not the document itself, regardless of the medium. It's not the document itself that is important, but the act of articulating and keeping track of changes in their own reasoning and understanding. If you're comfortable, that documentation may incorporate how students use AI as sparring partners to create friction with the purpose of hashing out meanings and implications of new information, as well as resolving any misconceptions that they detect. And you can include the AI chat transcripts in the documentation. The second component is feedback. Second, and probably the most important component, is the feedback loop. So this process orientation of assessment, it will not work without the feedback loop, because this feedback system is essentially what replaces the emphasis on points and grades. It is the process of receiving feedback and then acting on it that emphasizes to the students that learning is a continuous act of evolution and refinement. So the feedback really is the key. It's the thing that points the way to the progress after the test, that the test is not the end of the journey. So we can typically see three parts of meaningful feedback. You can say, here's what you did well, here's where you can still do better, and then here's what you can do to get better. That is a lot more informative than a student receiving a number of points out of a total number of possible points. This is the area where traditional assessments with grading that emphasize grades fall short, because they fail to communicate the specific nuances of the learning that is happening or differentiate between kinds of progress among diverse individuals. Consider, for example, this scenario. You have a student who already has enough prior knowledge, decides not to exert too much effort on a test because he knows he can pass. You have a second student, probably has absolutely zero background, decides to work hard and take all-nighters and look at different references, maybe watch YouTube tutorials. Okay. After the test, they both score 90. If you're only looking at the score, what do you know about who between those two students actually learned? Feedback is meant to give direction. Grades only tell you your position in the pyramid relative to your peers. Now, crucially, feedback is a two-way street. So as part of the feedback loop, teachers can have one-on-one conversations with their students to allow them to express their thoughts and talk about what they've learned or talk about their struggles. So this is an opportunity for the students to communicate to us the specific aspects of a lesson that they need help with, and then to make plans about how they can address those struggles moving forward. And perhaps they can even tell us themselves the kind of help that they need most. So that kind of one-on-one conversation, part of the feedback loop, is an opportunity for us to respond in real time, to commend them for whatever they have done well, to address misconceptions on the spot, and design individual plans for how they can improve their work and further their learning. Once again, what happens after the assessment is what's important. The third component is iteration. By iteration, we mean allowing students to revise their work, to resubmit, to improve. Earlier in our activity, it was a little bit divided, although more leaning towards agree when we put up the statement that it's unfair to allow other students to revise their work. It's unfair to those students who did it well the first time. It's unfair if it was about evaluating and grading. It's not unfair if it's about learning. Because as we said, learning means being able to improve. So once feedback has been received, students can then decide on how or whether even to incorporate the feedback on revised work. This part of the process will also include documentation where students record their decision making on the revisions, including explaining the specific changes that they made and justifying the decisions to reject or ignore some of the feedback, and reflecting on how they can incorporate new insight into future work. So reflections based on prior feedback could include answering questions like, what was the most challenging part of the task and why? What was the most important piece of feedback that you received and how did you incorporate it into the revision? And what would you do differently in a future task that shows what you learned from this task? And then, of course, once a revised draft has been submitted, the feedback loop begins again for however long as necessary or as long as circumstances will allow. So these opportunities to refine their work go a long way to emphasizing learning as a process and breaking down the traditional rewards and punishment paradigm around mere surface polish. And studies have confirmed the effectivity of these practices, how they can lessen stress, can encourage more risk-taking, and even decrease instances of academic dishonesty. Now, to talk about a goal, because we saw earlier, a lot of people agree that tests are necessary to motivate students to study their lessons. Well, we can also give them a different goal instead of the test itself. And this is where the presentation comes in. So the finished product does not necessarily need to focus on the final draft. Students can instead submit a complete portfolio that includes all the initial drafts, the earlier drafts, together with the documentations that keep track of the revisions and the reflections. In addition, those the final takeaways from the task or assessment could again be communicated through different media, again, including video essays, infographics, podcasts, maybe even animations if you have those kinds of creative students, and allowing students to choose the medium that they are most comfortable expressing themselves. So there are already some schools that practice what's called portfolio-based assessments. They have students present their total body of work over a term or the year, and then defend their progress before a panel, not just of their teacher, but their peers, other observers, possibly parents, maybe teachers who did not teach them that. This gives them a chance to articulate and explain in person all the things that they have learned and to narrate their personal journeys before an audience that is not just there to judge them, but also to support them. So by allowing them to express what they've learned, we are not limiting them to being able to show it based on the questions that we ask. Now, beyond that, students can also be encouraged by public exhibitions of student work, which gives students an opportunity to present what they have learned before a more meaningful and diverse audience. Such events could be a culmination of a term that gives students a goal to work towards that has a little bit of a more personal significance, where you present your work to other students, perhaps students from lower levels, to your parents, to visitors and other guests that come to the school just to see those work that the students produce. So it is necessary to change the perceptions of assessments as the goal of education, to change the behaviors that students have ingrained from years of schooling, to lessen the incentives of outsourcing cognitive labor to AI. Students need to see the value of experiencing struggle and friction in the learning process. So the big issue here around assessment is how the measurable outcomes of the assessment have become more central to the education system than the actual learning. But it is those aspects of learning that resist being condensed into a single numerical value that are the most meaningful in evaluating progress. Learning is a process, not a product. It's the journey, not the destination. Being educated is not a state of being, it is a lifestyle. And our assessments, the way we assess students, must reflect those principles. If the point were simply to move oneself from one place to another, why wouldn't you take the fastest way possible? So it is on us to help these travelers understand the beauty of taking the scenic route and the inherent value of, you know, taking a walk once in a while. Now, it is not lost on me that some of the things, maybe all of the things that I've just described here are difficult and will require extra time and effort that, simply may not be available. And I know this because I've also tried it. And many times I'm too tired, maybe not even too tired, just sometimes not in the mood. The idea of having one-on-one conversations with all of your students can definitely be daunting. But that's why traditional assessments are so appealing. It's because they're so easy to implement. But easy doesn't mean effective. And the urgency of the situation now and the conviction that this is the right thing to do is something that pushes me to at least keep trying. Maybe baby steps. So there's no way for me to argue that this is easy or simple, or even that the results will be immediate. Remember, this system will also require more time and effort from your students. And you can expect resistance and even regression, at least initially, from the students who have spent their lives working within the context where the grades are the goal and where there are means to attain those grades with minimal effort. So this is not a magic fix. But allow me to appeal to our collective conscience. I believe that at the end of the day, all teachers want to do right by their students. I believe that for teachers, that means seeing their students learn in a meaningful way and not just be content with earning a grade. So my hope tonight is to have sparked something in you to consider this a more effective way to achieve that goal. Yes, it's the hard way, but my conviction is it's the right way. As teachers, we find ways. We always find ways. That's just what we do because we know what's at stake. So over time, assessments have more and more taken the function of gatekeeping. They determine which students move on, who gets left behind, who gets access to certain opportunities. Education should not be about gatekeeping. It should be about opening doors and tearing down walls. It should be about exploring, not just about sticking to the beaten path. It's about making the possibilities of the future wide open and not just concentrating on the narrow goal in the present. It's to make our teaching meaningful in the age of AI. We need to focus on the real treasure in our classrooms, not the scores or the grades or even the diplomas and the medals. The real treasure is the humans, our students, our children, and the value of their lived experiences for learning. Thank you very much.